In this video, let's have a look at a few internal built-in PHP functions. We have already used a number of different built-in functions such as define, call user-func, var dump, printer, and so on. But let's have a look at a few different ones in a little bit more detail. The first one we're going to have a look at is PHP info. I know we've already used this one, but let's quickly have a look at the documentation for it. So PHP info outputs information about PHP's configuration, and description, it returns Boolean. What it does basically takes one optional argument as well, outputs a large amount of information about the current state of PHP. This includes information about PHP compilation options and extensions, the PHP version, server information, environment, and blah 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 blah. Let's go to the next sentence. Because every system is set up differently, PHP info is commonly used to check configuration settings and for available predefined variables on a given system, which is what we did in one of the videos. PHP info is also a valuable debugging tool as it contains all EGPCS, which stands for environment, get, post, cookie, server, data. As you saw, that was one of the reasons why we actually checked this to see which order these are going to be fetched, basically. So we knew that the post will override the get request and so on. Okay, and then let's have a look at the parameters. The what parameter, the only, and it's optional. The output may be customized by passing one or more of the following constants. Bitwise values summed together in the optional what parameter. One can also combine the respective constants or bitwise values together with the OR operator. Okay, so that means that you can pass more than one of these constants. Let's try the PHP info without any constants, and then let's give it a try with this one info general. Okay, if we go back to the editor and simply call this PHP info without any argument, and when it's set that it returns Boolean, that means that if we were to associate the output of it, basically of this function with a variable, that would give us either true or false. But the function itself echoes the statement to the browser. I mean, returns the statement straight to the browser in the echo format as a string, basically, so that it's automatically displayed. You'll see we don't use echo statement at all, but it will be available in the browser if we go to phpcourse.dev, refresh the page, and there we go. There's all the information about the server configuration and so on. But let's try and pass this flag to it, this argument, this constant, info general. And if we now save it, preview it in the browser, refresh the page, and as you can see, that's the only thing we can see. We don't have any more information. Let's try and add credits perhaps as well. Info credit. So if we go back to the editor, now we're going to use one vertical bar and then add this second option. If we refresh the browser, refresh the page, as you can see, now we've got credit as well for the PHP. Basically, if you want to see more, you can add another one, let's say info configuration. You can add as many as you want, but I'm just going to try and play with two at the same time. Let's see this general info and configuration. So if we go back, refresh the page, we have this general info and the configuration. So that's all we can see, basically. So you can obviously play with these flags depending on what you're trying to get. If you don't pass any, then you're going to get all of the data, basically. And then we have this return values, returns true on success or false on failure. But it also echoes everything to the browser at the same time. Okay, so that's PHP info. Let's have a look at another function called isSet. So isSet, and if we hit enter, and this function determines if a variable is set and is not null, and it returns Boolean. It takes either one or multiple variables as an argument, and then if a variable has been unset with the unset function, it will no longer be set, which is what we obviously tested earlier as well. IsSet will return false if testing a variable that has been set to null. So if a variable has a value null associated with it, that will return false. Also note that a null character, as 0, integer basically, is not equivalent to the PHP null constant. If multiple parameters are supplied, then isSet will return true only if all of the parameters are set. Evaluation goes from left to right and stops as soon as an unset variable is encountered. And then we have parameters, obviously the variable to be checked, and then another one as many as you need, obviously. So let's go to the editor and have a look how we can test this specific function. So we are going to use var dump to see whether the return value is true or false, the boolean true or false. And what we are going to do is test is set, and we are going to start with the non-existent variable. So variable, there we go. If we save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and we get boolean false. Of course, it's not set because we haven't set it yet. Now, if we try the same with the variable, so variable equals 1, and now we know it's set, so it should return true. Now let's try another one and set it to null. And we know it did say that if it's set to null, it evaluates to false. So is set should return false. And there we go, we get boolean false. And then what else can we do? Let's say variable, first one will be set to 1, then let's duplicate it, create variable 2, for instance, set to whatever. Let's keep it the same, and then pass them through, so variable 2, and let's create variable 3 as well, which does not exist, and we know that this whole thing should now fail, should return false, because at least one of them does not evaluate to true. Basically, does not exist, and that's where we get boolean false. But if we remove this third argument, and we know the previous two have been defined, so if we create it, save it, preview in the browser, everything works fine. Obviously, this isSet is usually used in conditional statements because it's obviously returning boolean value. Then you can obviously use if isSet this, do this, otherwise obviously you do something different. So isSet is usually used with the conditional statements. Okay, let's have a look at the unset one. I'm going to remove everything from the editor. If we go back to the browser and check the unset, which we actually have here on the right hand side in the navigation, and then unset a given variable, that's what it does, and it's void function, so it doesn't return anything. It basically unsets, destroys the specified variable. The behavior of unset inside of a function can vary depending on what type of variable you are attempting to destroy. If a globalized variable is unset inside of the function, only the local variable is destroyed. The variable in the calling environment will retain the same value as before unset was called. So in other words, if we have situation like here, you can see in this first example, we've got a function destroy full. We imported this full variable from here by using this global keyword, and then we unset it. We only unset it for this function. The unset inside of the function does not affect the global variable which we imported basically. So we still should see this. Let's copy this example and try it in the editor. If we go back, save it, and let's preview everything in the browser, refresh the page. As you can see, we still can see bar even though we've unset it calling this function basically. But again, because it's in the private scope, it's inside of the function, this unset does not affect the parent scope, in this case the global scope. Okay, so that's the unset function. Let's go back to our documentation. What else have we got here? To unset a global variable inside of a function, then use globals array to do so. And we haven't covered, that's the only super global that we haven't actually covered. Basically, global stores all global variables. If we open this in a new tab, I didn't want to use it, I didn't want to go through this because I don't really use it at all. And if you're like me, then you probably won't ever use global, super global at all. An associative array containing references to all variables which are currently defined in the global scope of the script. The variable names are the keys of the array. Let's quickly go back to the editor and let's give it a try. So what we are going to do is I'm going to remove all this actually, and I'm going to define a few global variables. So variable, say name, Sebastian, should probably use capital letter for the name. And then we're going to create, let's say, town. Let's call it Bristol. And then we are going to create a function which uses these, say, global vars. And what I'm going to do here is simply print this globals array. And I'm going to simply call this function global vars. that we can see what global variables are available. Obviously, it should contain these two as well because we put them in a global scope. So if we refresh the page, as you can see, there's quite a few. And we've got this get, post, cookie, files, which are obviously super globals. Then we have globals as well, which contains this custom, the array with our custom entries, which is this name and town, which we've added to the global scope basically right before the function itself. So by adding to this global scope, we also add into this globals super global. Now, so we know that we can use this global super global to unset the global variable from within a function, which is cool. But before we do this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep these two variables here. And what I'm going to do is create a function unset variable. And then we're going to pass variable name as an argument. And before I do this, what I want to do actually is to show you that even if we pass it as a reference, it's not going to remove it either. So whether you use global keyword or pass it as a reference, it's not going to affect the variable in the global or in the parent scope. Okay, and now if we simply call unset variable and pass the name, let's say, and if I echo name from the global scope, we should still see the name here. As you can see, it's still here. So it didn't unset even though it's been passed by a reference. Normally it's updating when you're passing variables by a reference. Obviously, as you remember from the previous video, you would affect them in any way. You would update them basically, but you cannot unset them from within the function. Okay, so we know this doesn't work. Let's now remove this argument altogether and let's unset it by using the globals super global. So globals, and now the name of the variable will be name in lowercase. Okay, unset variable, obviously we don't pass any argument now. And if we now try and echo the name after calling this unset variable on the name variable, if we refresh the page, there we go, undefined variable name. This time it did work. So that's the only way to unset the global variables or parent variables, global variables, because they have to be in a global scope from within the function. The next function on our list is the empty. From the unset page, click on the empty on the right hand side navigation. And empty obviously is the one which we've used on quite a few occasions already, and it determines whether a variable is empty, and it returns boolean true or false. We pass just one argument and determine whether a variable is considered to be empty. A variable is considered empty if it does not exist or if it evaluates, basically if its value equals false. Empty does not generate a warning if the variable does not exist. So that's a pretty important thing to remember as well. Parameters, we take in the variable to be checked, and then we have a note. Prior to PHP 5.5, empty only supports variables. Anything else will result in a parser. In other words, the following will not work: empty trim name. This is obviously the expression. It uses the function and then passes the variable to it, and all that is passed as an argument, which will not work in PHP version prior to 5.5. Instead, use trim name double equal false, basically without empty, but just when you're doing the conditional statement, just use this instead of this, obviously, and using the empty function itself. No warning is generated if the variable does not exist. That means empty is essentially the concise equivalent to isn't set variable or variable double equal false. It returns false if variable exists and has non-empty and non-zero value, otherwise returns true. With is set, 0 as an integer would evaluate still to true. So it would be set to true. If variable has 0 associated with it, it would be true. It's only null that didn't work. But with empty, if the expression or basically the variable has 0 associated with it, then it will return true, because basically 0 within empty function is considered to be an empty value. The following things are considered to be empty: an empty string, 0 as an integer, as I've just explained, a 0 as floating point. As you can see, we've got decimal point here, which makes it a float. Then we have 0 inside of the double quotes inside of the string, which will evaluate to the 0 as an integer, and then it's obviously an empty. in which and then we have null value. False is also considered to be empty. An empty array is considered to be an empty, and a variable declared but without the value associated is also considered to be empty. Let's go to the editor and have a look at a few of the examples. We are going to start with the variable. Let's call it simply var, and the first value we're going to associate with this variable will be simply an empty string. And then we are going to use var underscore dump function, and we pass this empty function in, and then we are going to pass this variable as an argument. Let's save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page. Boolean true. Obviously, empty string evaluates to Boolean false, basically. That's why we have this empty, checking for an empty, it evaluates to true. Next, if we associate 0 with it, and as we obviously explained already, 0 evaluates to Boolean false, in which case empty will return true again. Next one will be an integer, let's say 1. Save it, preview it in a browser, refresh, and false, because 1 is not empty, is not false, in other words. Okay, let's try now with the negative 1. Save it, preview it in a browser, and it's also false, because as you may remember, out of the integers, only 0 was evaluating to Boolean false. The negative numbers were also true. That's one, obviously. -1 is not empty, in other words. Okay, so now let's try a string, something. And we know obviously string returns true, Boolean true, so obviously, again, it's not going to be empty, in which case we get false. If we go back, let's now try an empty array, and I'm going to use square brackets approach, and if we preview in the browser, Boolean true, because empty array is considered to be empty. In other words, obviously, false as well. Boolean false. Okay, next one will be false, simply Boolean false, and obviously Boolean false is empty. If we refresh the page, so it's true again. If we try with Boolean true, save it and preview it in the browser, refresh, and Boolean true obviously is not empty, so it's going to give us false. Then we are going to try null, and null obviously is false, so if we save it, preview it in the browser, refresh the page, and null is obviously considered to be empty. Then let's try with, what else can we try? Let's try an expression now. I'm running version higher than 5.5. I've got 5.6 here. So yeah, so obviously can run expressions. So let's try 1 minus 1. That's the space here. And we can actually put it all directly into the empty function. So if we save it, refresh the page, and it's true because 1 minus 1 gives us 0, and 0 is considered to be empty. And then the last thing, let's try for non-negative. So if I'm just going to remove this variable for now. There are quite a few brackets. We could obviously leave these brackets off as well here with this expression, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, now I'm going to try with 0, but instead of checking for empty, I'm going to check if it's not empty. You don't have to use these spaces between the exclamation mark, but I like to use it this way so that it's clear actually that I'm using the opposite of what I'm actually calling. So if I check this, refresh the page, and it's false because 0 is empty. If we check if it's not, then obviously it's gonna give us Boolean false. Now I keep calling empty a function, but in fact it's a language construct, same as echo, return, and so on. So obviously we wouldn't be able to use empty together with the variable functions as explained in the previous video.